Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and you are in for a treat today because I am in for a treat today. We're going to visit with Brad Farris about his role as a business coach, advisor, mastermind facilitator, and personal growth director. Brad, with that somewhat long winded introduction, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thank you, Tom. I'm looking forward to it.
Brad, could you tell our audience your professional background?
Sure. I started life as an engineer, got confused when I designed the thing that the marketing people told me they wanted, and then it didn't sell well. And so I ended up learning a little about marketing, a little about accounting, became a general manager. And after that, started helping entrepreneurial business owners to grow their business. So entrepreneurial business owners get to a certain point where they need to change the model of their business into a more managerial model. And so I helped them with that for about 15 years. And then I pivoted to coaching to really getting on the same side of the table as the business founder, helping them to grow their business.
Brad, I'm the son of an engineer who became an engineering professor. So I've been around engineers a lot. And I will say that you have probably laughed more than any engineer I've ever known in the last 90 seconds of this podcast. So you may have been miscast as an engineer. You
I
certainly
probably
stand out.
was. I got an engineering degree because I love to solve problems, but I figured out later that I love people problems more than thing problems. And so that's how that all turned out.
Even through the last presidential election, we had a lot of discussion of the schools of leadership for entrepreneurs and startups. We have the startup leader, and as the company matures, they may need to bring in a more mature leader. How can leaders actually grow, though, if they want to adapt their leadership style as their organization evolves?
That's a great question. And I want to separate out a couple of things there. I think that too much of the business conversation is about Silicon Valley venture funded startups. That's a very small portion of the actual economy and is not really relevant to the way most people's businesses run. Most of us, when we start businesses, start service businesses that are very quickly profitable. And as the owner, we tend to get involved in the service delivery. And so if we started life as a designer and ended up starting a design firm, we start bringing people around us to do more of the work, but we are still the designer in the firm. And as the firm grows, we get to a certain point where the firm needs the leader to give up that service delivery role and start being the CEO, start leading the business into the next generation of its growth. And that can be really challenging because the person who started out as a designer and is now leading a design firm, when they give up design, it's almost like giving up a part of their identity. And so there's a big shift that has to happen there in terms of how they evaluate their success, how they schedule their time, how are they measuring whether or not they're being successful. All of those things start to shift as they give up that service design role.
So I have to start by pushing back on the Silicon Valley because I think you described exactly a Silicon Valley entrepreneur founder, except they may be a coder.
That's true.
They may be a design person. And I come out, I'm a lawyer by professional
Yeah.
training, and I've seen that happen multiple times in small law firms.
That's
Um,
definitely happens in law firms for sure.
I have been a solo entrepreneur for 15 years, and there's a reason for that. Uh, Although my boss is a jerk,
He is.
he's a complete jerk, and he never gives me Friday afternoon off. I don't have to listen to anybody but him. And so it's a really I've always been fascinated with that question because even in large law firms, and I came out of big law
Yes.
as a younger lawyer, the model was the best lawyer became managing partner.
Yes.
That was the recipe for disaster.
Best lawyer is not the best leader.
And so how do we identify a potential leader? Or we started this question with how does a leader who is great as a coder, as a designer, as a
Mhm.
service provider, as a lawyer, how can they make that shift if they're really that good, technically good at what they do?
So I want to start out by saying that you always have the option to stay in that individual contributor role. If you are the world's best, I have a client who is the world's expert in sales tax, and there's no one else that knows more about sales tax than she does. And for her to give up consulting or being the expert would diminish the value of the overall firm. And so in her organization, we needed to build other people up to be that leader because her expertise was so valuable. But in most organizations, that's not true. In most organizations, the leader, when they stop seeing themselves as the person who's delivering the value and instead start seeing themselves as someone who is creating the machine, the container, the engine that creates value, then they shift from being a better lawyer to creating a better law firm or creating a better business that is a platform for other lawyers to deliver value. And oftentimes there's so much leverage that comes out of that, of having other people be able to deliver the service, that the organization can grow to make a much greater impact, can attract more profits, and can be a better place for the overall organization to thrive.
How do you answer the question of when a customer says, "That's great, Brad, I want you." "That's great, Brad, I want you. I don't want Brad Jr. or
Yeah.
Tom or anyone else." How do you deal with the customer who really wants you? You develop the relationship, they trust you, and you're their guy.
So there's two things to pull apart there. Number one is someone who you have had that relationship with for a long time. That's one situation. The other is a new situation where someone comes to the firm brand new and they say, Brad, I want to work with you because you're the expert. I when I was in doing consulting, I had that challenge over and over again. And what I would do is to bring someone with me to that first meeting. I would never go to a meeting alone. And so I always brought that second person with me and I would set them up from the very beginning as the expert. Hey, Mike and I are here to talk to you about your problem. Mike has a lot of experience in this area, and I'm confident that he's going to be able to solve the problem for you. And so, right from the beginning, I'm positioning Mike as the person who's going to do that work. It's not that I'm going away. You can always still reach me. But then when you send me a question, I will often just ask Mike to respond. And so over time, the client learns that Mike actually has the answers that the client needs and can solve those problems and naturally starts going to Mike. Now, if it's someone who has a long-standing relationship, it's a much slower transition. But there you can also just be more honest and say, hey, I know that you and I have worked closely over the years, and I'm not going away, but I'm doing less of this work. And Sheila is taking over this and her expertise is growing and my expertise is shrinking. So I'm going to have Sheila work directly with you. If you need me, I'm still here, but I know that Sheila can answer your questions for you. And then the same kind of thing when the client brings questions, Sheila responds, and over time they come to trust that that thing is going to work.
So many of the skills that I saw in the law firm world, or some of them, and you articulated one with your colleague or friend or customer or client who is a sales tax expert, is technical competence.
Yes.
And that's certainly important in the law firm world. But it's also a sadistic person who wants to work 12 to 15 hours a day. And
Exactly.
it's not just a law firm world, it's a lot of worlds where you
Yeah.
work like that. We're typically highly driven and highly competitive individuals, so that if somebody else is gonna work that hard, we may just wanna work harder than him just to have more hours than them.
Hmm.
So how do you sort of is that just a process of identifying someone who has those traits and maybe not promoting them to leadership? Or is it something else?
It's super hard not to promote those people to leadership because, like you say, they tend to bring a lot of value to the firm. Um, However, we can start to help them to find other things to value. So, valuing personal expertise and how many hours you can bill is one way to get status in a firm. And we can talk to them about what's that going to be like when you're 60? Are you wanting to work this hard another 20 years, another 30 years? Or what would it be like to you to be able to be someone who brings young people forward? Think about that person in your life who gave you a chance to do work that was maybe a little bit over your head, where you really grew and learned new things and had that feeling of new competence. What if you could give that to other people? And so we can start to invite them into seeing themselves in a different role and valuing themselves for different things. I think we get stuck in that technical competence role because that's what that's how we've delivered value. That's what's given us security. But there are other ways that we can get that, and that might end up being more satisfying for us in the long run.
So do you have any examples that you could share with us, maybe 2 or 3 or of people who you have worked with that have successfully transitioned
Yeah.
from the solo entrepreneur or entrepreneur type leadership role to a more managerial leadership role?
Yeah, I had a gentleman that I worked with earlier this year who he was a really creative guy. In his 20s, he was in a traveling rock band. And then when that kind of petered out, he joined the air guitar circuit and ended up competing in Norway at the World Air Guitar Championships. And so he has this creative part of him, and he turned that into a video production company where he's making videos for companies that have that more creative kind of bent to them that aren't so boring the way most corporate videos are. But it was so successful that he started hiring creative directors and people to do more of the work. And he found himself less and less in the day to day of doing the creative work. And he did that just because he had demand coming in and he knew that he didn't want to be working 14 hours a day. And he also recognized that to maintain the level of creativity, he needed some time off. That time off actually earned him better work when he was focused. And so he came to me and said, Brad, how can I maintain this creative part of me when I'm not doing as much of the creative work anymore? And we went back and forth. And one of the things that I said is, you don't have to meet all of your needs in the business. And that sparked something in him where he rented a recording studio and brought some of his friends together on a long weekend and recorded an album. And he came back from that so energized and so ready to deliver better work for his team that he recognized that just having that creative outlet outside of the business meant that he was much better when he was in the business. So that's one example of the way that I find helping people to let go of some of that technical competence in the business. They can find another outlet for it somewhere else.
Let me ask you about time horizons.
Hmm.
And what sort of is everyone individual? Do you have some general parameters that you try to give people? What's the long-term key to an impact of a CEO on the time horizons?
Yeah. So this is a really important concept when we're talking about moving people out of that technical role, that when we're in service delivery, the time horizon that we're focused on is usually just a few weeks. A project comes in, we're working on the project, we're going to deliver it. And so we kind of have a time horizon that's really close to the present. But the organization itself needs someone who's looking out at a broader time horizon. There are changes happening in the marketplace. There are changes happening with our customers and with our employee base that need to be handled on a longer time horizon, months and even years out into the future. And so, if as a leader, we're focused on problems that are being solved today, there's no one spending their time looking out at the broader horizon. And right now, there are a ton of things that are upsetting professional services firms, AI, the way Gen Z and the millennials want to work. There are a lot of forces that are forcing us to change the things that we're doing. And so, if you as the leader aren't looking out at those things, there are icebergs out there that you're going to run into. And so helping the leader to start focusing outside the organization, focusing on things that are further away is another way to help them to let go of some of that technical stuff. Because even if they focus long term, when the client has a problem this week, I get focused on the thing that's this week. And so if we want to have that longer term impact, if we want our firm to succeed in the long run, we need to be willing to let go of some of that day to day.
Let me pick up on AI if I could for a few
Sure.
minutes because I am a solo. I'm a solo lawyer and I'm a
Mhm.
solo podcast network founder.
Yes.
And I found AI gives me 2 things. One, a little bit of greater efficiency,
Mhm.
but number 2, and probably 95% is I got a lot more resources to draw upon. And from the content creation perspective, it's an explosion. I already work 12 to 15 hours a day. I don't need an explosion of content. I'm and so in many ways, yeah, I can crank out more, but it's just more.
That's right.
And I'm not complaining about having more, not too much. But that's what I found, and I've not really been able to transition to some other use of it. Have you either seen that problem or seen a solution to that problem?
I think that the insight that you had there is really critical, that content was an advantage when it was difficult to produce good content. And for instance, for professionals, the hallmark of success has always been writing a book, because writing a book is hard. It takes a lot of effort. You need to organize your expertise in a way that other people can see it. But if those things become easier, then they're no longer differentiators. And so we really have to think about two things. Number one, if AI is making content generation easier, what are we going to use to differentiate ourselves if it's not content? And it's probably going to be relationship. Having ways that we're actually building relationships with people who can hire us, as opposed to spraying content out into the universe and hoping that those people show up. That's a way to differentiate ourselves when content is essentially free. The other thing I think about is that it takes humans a long time to learn how to use a new technology. Um, Computers at first were not that useful. And it took us 20 or 30 years to figure out how to make computers something that everybody needed to use. I think right now we're using AI for the dumbest possible things that we can be using it for. Content creation is, I mean, it is easy. AI can create content really easily, but it's not that great content. The places that I see that people are using AI that I'm really excited about are data analysis, creating avatars, and sort of representations of different groups of people that we can then talk to and do better market research with. I see people using AI for things that are solving much higher order problems than content creation. And that's where I'm excited about AI going.
I certainly agree with, that part. I just haven't been able to quite get there yet on that. Perhaps we could explore that on another pod.
I think it'd
Uh,
be an interesting conversation to see some examples.
Let me transition over to your mastermind
Hmm.
and ask you, first of all, for anyone in the audience who doesn't know what a mastermind is, explain what it is, and then how do you run your mastermind?
Hmm. So masterminds come from a concept developed by Rockefeller, where he said all of us are smarter than one of us. And it's the rich one, Franklin
John D,
Gandhi. Thank you.
the founder? Okay.
Yes, exactly. So the idea behind a mastermind is that we get a group of people in the room, and the way that I run it, those people have things in common. So I generally have emerging founders in my mastermind, people that are approaching the $1 million mark and haven't quite broken through. And because we all have similar challenges, when we bring our challenges and we're being very transparent about what our challenges are, we often find that there's someone in the room for whom that's easy. And so the thing that's hard for me is easy for someone else. And then the thing that's hard for that person is easy for me. And so by sharing our experiences and our challenges, we all learn more quickly. The other thing that's true is it's often easier to find the solution to someone else's problem, even if you have that exact same problem. And so sometimes when we're giving advice to other people in the mastermind, we're like, hey, maybe I should do that too. And so the way I run it is everybody gets a slice of time in the mastermind, and we invite them to bring an issue that's in front of them, something that's really pertinent to preventing them from growing their business. And then they present that problem to the group, and the group brainstorms around that and helps them to find a solution. And then we move on to the next person. And so it's just some time to troubleshoot specific issues with a group of people who are sympathetic and who might have a different point of view than you have.
Do you bring in outside experts or others to talk to the group from time to time?
Very rarely. There are times when everyone in the group is having a very similar challenge, and I might bring an expert in around that. What I've done more often is sort of like we're doing, I might talk to an expert and record it, then make that recording available to the group. Uh, because the group time itself, people really like having the interaction. And so it's hard to take up too much of that time with a speaker. But I will often bring in ideas from other people, either through a recording or through sending out a chapter from a book or a blog post or a podcast episode or something like that.
Let me go back to the Horizon timeline and maybe move beyond where a CEO or an founding entrepreneur has become a more of a managerial CEO, and they want to move towards potentially cashing out,
Yes.
monetizing their business or
Yeah.
whatever we want to call it. What are some of the key things that you advocate we all start thinking about?
So one of the shifts as we move out of that service delivery mode and into having longer time horizons is that we're going to spend more time outside our business than we had in the past. We're going to start looking at different industries, our own industry and the industries our customers are in. And we're going to try to see what problems are coming down the pike that we could potentially solve. All of those, that time that we're spending outside is also helping us to meet people who would ultimately be the acquirer for our business. There are two main sources of acquisition partners. One is your customers who want to more vertically integrate, and the other is some sort of competitor who wants to add on the thing that you do to something that they're already doing. And so, as we're out there in the marketplace, meeting with larger customers and meeting with people that are our peers, we're looking for the people that we want to date before we get married. And so, we want to do some projects with different people, getting to know them, getting to know their style, always with the idea that this person might at some point decide to make an acquisition. And so you're building some relationships that, as my father used to say, you're digging the well before you need the water. You're starting to build some relationships with people who might ultimately be an acquirer for your business. While you're doing that, you're also finding people that have capital. And that's the third option, is to just use other people's money to grow the business rather than maybe selling it. Maybe your team is going to buy it from you and you need some outside capital to make that happen. You're going to meet those people in those spaces also.
What are some of the common pitfalls do you see at this stage?
Looking for outside capital or looking to,
Sell your business.
yeah. So here's the interesting thing. For you, this is the one time in your life that you're going to do this kind of transaction. For the buyer, when I worked in corporate before I went on my own, part of my job was to buy businesses. And so I looked at 100 businesses a year. I probably bought 10 businesses a year. And so the power imbalance between the seller and the buyer is really extreme. I'm doing this 10 times a year. You're doing this once in your entire life. And so having some advisors around you who are in the transaction game is really valuable. The corporate lawyer that you've been using to review your contracts, that's probably not the person that you want when you go into an acquisition conversation. You want someone who just does transactions. And so bringing along some professional advisors, I think, is the primary mistake. I think the second mistake is getting in love with one particular buyer. When you're selling, you have more leverage when there are multiple buyers. And so getting into a situation where you have more than one option is ideal. For many people who are selling, they find one person and they kind of marry the first person that they ever date. And that there are a lot of problems that arise from that.
You touched on this a little bit earlier, and I wanted to follow up a little bit. And that was around our conversation on how do you sort of break someone from either looking at the billable hours or outworking
Hmm.
everyone else. And one of the strategies might be to suggest them as a mentor.
Hmm.
And I worked for three very dynamic women in my professional career, and they became lawyers in the 70s and 80s. And they kind of three traits, one of which they had their own style in terms of dress. One dressed to the nines, one dressed like a truck driver, one was sort of in the middle. Two, they were as smart as anyone
Hmm.
because they had to beat the boys.
Yes.
And three, they beat the boys.
Yes.
And they'd been beating the boys all their life
That's right.
because they were the smartest girl. And each one of those women, I sat down and said that to them, that they were dynamic leaders. They were leaders I wanted to follow. They were leaders that obviously led these companies, and they led men.
Hmm.
One was a lawyer, one was an engineer, and the third one was petrochemical company.
Hmm.
And so I challenged them to be a mentor to other women.
Mm.
And they first, they appreciated my observations, but the thing they appreciated the most was when I told them they really should share that, and each one of them did in their own way.
Hmm.
And I'm, for better or worse, much older than most of my colleagues, and certainly in the podcast world, and unfortunately also in the compliance world. So I sort of taken on that role, and I kind of view everybody as my little brothers and my
Hmm.
little sisters, and so it's worked for me. Is that a conversation that you have successfully with people like me or those women I described?
So I think there's two different conversations that you're talking about there. One is the conversation about gender, and whether it's gender or race or any other kind of difference, I have found that addressing that directly early in the relationship is really important. To find a situation where someone is having some kind of challenge, and I ask them, how much of that do you think is about gender? Or how much of that do you think is about race? And because I open that door, it allows us to have conversations that we couldn't otherwise have. And so I think it's really helpful when, especially when we're white guys and we're working with people who are different from us, to open the door to say, how much of that is about difference? Because it just creates conversations that you couldn't otherwise have. And you, as the older white guy, have some insight into how that happens from the other side that can be useful for them. The second is, how can people become more of a mentor and how they can share that what they've learned with the next generation? And I think that people get to a certain level of success where that starts to become more interesting to them. And as an advisor, if I can align with things that are emerging, things that they haven't yet mastered, then I can be more influential. And so if there's a desire that's coming online that they don't yet know how to take advantage of, again, opening that conversation creates new avenues for us to talk and new ways that I can be influential.
The most of my audience are not most, a large portion of my audience are
Yep.
compliance professionals.
Yep.
And so one of the things I try to do is have non-compliance professionals talk to my people, or I
Love.
say, have
Yep.
your people talk to my people to bring new insights. But I wanted to maybe ask you, how do you see this growth inside of a corporation? Because you've been in a
Mhm.
corporation, and how do you does it translate sort of an interdepartment, like a compliance
Mm,
function, like a legal function, like an engineering function?
yep.
Are these conversations that should be happening inside of corporations as well?
For sure. I'm really glad that you brought that up. I have two stories that I can think of there. One, when we were doing acquisitions, we had a long string where we were bidding on some things that didn't come to fruition. And the owner, this is a privately held company, the owner came into a meeting and brought the whole acquisition team together. And he looked at the legal team. He said, listen, I don't want you guys to be the deal prevention team. If we don't get any deals done, you're going to get fired. And that changed their method, their thought process from, we're gonna make everything be totally safe, to, we're gonna find ways to manage the risk in these transactions, and we're gonna inform the owner about, I don't feel totally comfortable with this, but here's some ways that we can mitigate that. And so there are some times where whatever bubble that we're seeing the whole world through that bubble and not realizing how that's impacting the rest of the team that we're a part of. And I think there can be some conversations had that kind of change the way people perceive that. I think the other example that I that comes to mind is an engineer who, we were actually at a board meeting and we were having a terrible technical issue with the product that we were working on. And the CEO asked him to explain the issue. And the engineer, he started to think for a minute and he looked off in the distance and he said, let me see if I can explain this to you in a way that you can understand it. And he was trying to be helpful. Honestly, he was trying to do what he thought the CEO had asked him to do. But what a massive insult that was. And you could hear all the oxygen in the room get sucked out. But the engineer just kind of kept thinking and finally came up with a way of saying it that actually was really helpful. And so just being more self-aware and getting feedback from people that are outside, again, your specialty bubble, it's another form of difference that we can open up a conversation. And so when I went to the marketing people, my initial feeling was, okay, you guys are doing your job wrong because I designed this product the way you asked me to and it wasn't a success. So I'm gonna have to come figure out what you do. If I approached it from that perspective, they weren't very interested in having a conversation with me. But if I approached it from a curiosity perspective of, hey, tell me how you guys do this stuff, it seems really interesting to me, I learned a lot more. And so finding a way to have conversations in a way that the other person finds them interesting and useful.
Unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted to connect with you or find out any more information about your consulting practice, what might be the best place or places for them to go?
Sure. My website is anchoradvisors.com. And if you go to anchoradvisors.com/growth-phase, there's an assessment there that can tell you sort of where your business is in that overall life phase that we talked about. Are you in the phase of emerging? Are you in the growth phase? Are you getting ready to think about using other people's money? And so that can be a useful tool to help you locate yourself. And then at the end, we give you some pointers as to how to get to that next phase. It doesn't require an email address. You can get all the information just by taking the assessment. And then for those on the corporate side, there is another assessment, anchoradvisors.com/self-leadership-assessment. The self leadership assessment helps us to see how we are leading ourselves, because the first task is to lead ourselves, to have that self awareness and the flexibility and resilience to be able to respond to situations. And again, this is an assessment that helps you to see where there are opportunities for growth. Again, you don't have to give me an email address to get the answer. It's going to give you the results right there. So those are some next steps for different.
Brad, I've just had a ton of fun talking to
I mean,
you.
I had fun, Tom.
I hope we can continue this conversation.
Sure, let's do it.